Welcome to week 2 of Identity, Vocation and Mission. This week we're going to examine closely St. Ignatius's interior life, which reveals to us the key aspects of his spiritual writings, including the spiritual exercises. Well, welcome back to week 2, an introduction to the interior life of Ignatius and the spiritual exercises. To understand the Ignatian school of spirituality in depth, we need to examine its base and point of departure. That is, the interior life of St. Ignatius of Loyola. To understand the spirituality of the Society of Jesus, Ignatian spirituality, a study of the spiritual experience of Ignatius is essential. Our key questions are: what was St. Ignatius' personal interior life? What was the manner by which he spiritually formed his first companions? What doctrine has he taught in his spiritual writings? There are 5 distinct stages of interior development in Ignatius's life: his conversion in 1521, the period between March 1522 and February 1524, his time at Montserrat, Manresa and Jerusalem, his academic studies in Paris, his ministry years that he spent Upper Italy and Rome, the founding of the Society on September 27, 1540, and the spiritual climax of his life journey, 1540 until his death in 1556. As with all saint stories, and as with all discipleship stories, most disciples will be able to pinpoint the time of their conversion. This is usually, while it may not be dramatic, is a time that a disciple can point to, which pinpoints when Jesus came into their life and they made a clear decision to follow him. For Ignatius, he was born in 1491, and he left all of his worldly pursuits to pursue an apostolic life when he was about 30 years old. Of his life prior to his conversion, one of his early companions, Polanco, said, quote, "Although much attached to the faith, he did not live in accordance with his belief, and he did not keep himself from sin. He was especially out of order with regard to gambling, women, and dueling." Close quotes. Spiritual influences during this time are difficult to detect, and it would seem that Ignatius had a little developed interior life. As a soldier, he went into battle, and a momentous moment in his life occurred following him being wounded at Pamplona on May 21st, 1521. During his convalescence, he began a period of being forced to turn inwards. It would seem that this wound became a catalyst that led him to begin to examine his interior life. His reading at this time consisted of 2 books, as there was very little else in the house to read. One is A Life of Christ by Ludolf of Saxony, and the other The Lives of the Saints by Voriginini. Today, this book is being published as The Golden Legend. His reflections, that is Ignatius's, on the content of these books, mixed with his reflection on worldly pursuits. Ignatius said he spent, quote, 2, 3, and 4 hours fancying that he would be able to do in the service of a lady, how he would be able to get where she lived, the words and speeches he would address to her, and the feats of arms he would perform in her service. The difficult and laborious aspects of the lives of saints did hold appeal to this soldier. Ignatius also imagined himself fasting, doing penances, and going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. At the centre of the lives depicted in this book is the eternal Prince, Christ Jesus. In this period, Ignatius experienced much desolation and consolation with his musings. Being attentive as he was, he became aware that his meditations on his worldly pursuits, while attractive to him, left him dry and discontented. But when he imagined himself sacrificing in the service of Christ, these thoughts left him feeling consoled. Nature too played an important role in Ignatius's conversion. He spent long hours looking at the stars and sky. During this time, he writes, he would feel in himself a great impetus towards serving our Lord. Ignatius was drawn in this moment to living a life of continual penance. He also was gifted with a vision of the Blessed Virgin, which he believed was from God. It is this vision that led him, says Ignatius, to forget his past thoughts with these holy desires that he was now having. So to summarise his early interior life, Ignatius, being the good soldier, had an idea of valiant and excellent service of our Lord. He was given much to imaginative contemplation. He always engaged in self-reflection and self-analysis. He worked to control his interior movements, and it was obvious, even in this early period, of his intense devotion to Mary. Manresa, 1522 to 1523. Upon his recovery, Ignatius left Loyola and headed for Montserrat and Manresa, and this marks the first stage of Ignatius's interior life growth. He desired to do marvellous deeds for Christ. The section of the spiritual exercises that this period of his life coincides with is the contemplation of the kingdom of Christ and the meditation of the two standards. These two meditations are centrally important for understanding the spirituality of the Society of Jesus and Ignatian spirituality in general. They form a major component of the spiritual exercises. Michael Ivers, S.J., says that the kingdom is closely connected to the two standards. That this section of the exercises is not a contemplation or a meditation, but one is gifted with a new self-image, a restored friendship in Christ. It has been described as a second principle and foundation. The contemplation of Christ in this section invites all to share his work in the world, as well as share the cost of his discipleship. Ignatius at Montserrat on March 25th, 1522, decided to formalise his commitment to his new life. He solemnised this new service of Christ the way all good knights do. Ignatius made a vigil of arms at Montserrat. This vigil of arms was a practice of soldiers before going into battle. They would spend the night looking at their weapons of war and meditating and reflecting on the battle ahead. The picture in the slide is an old drawing of a soldier's experience when the ghosts and demons, I suppose representing doubts and fears before going into a battle, would pursue the knight as he kept his lonely vigil. More and more, Ignatius at this period sought seclusion. So he left Montserrat and went to the little city of Manresa. Here took place the greatest transformation for Ignatius. He intended to work in a hospital, which he did, and while he was working there and reflecting and praying, he would enter some notes in his copybook, which he always carried with him. His journaling, or jottings, began in Loyola when he recorded notable words and deeds that he read in the lives of the saints. He always was careful to record his thoughts about the life of Christ, observations which he thought may also be of help to others. He continued this spiritual journaling discipline throughout his whole life. The spiritual exercises is a result of this disciplined practice. Two indicators of his maturing spiritual life were evident in this period. His desire for outstanding service of God extended beyond penances to apostolic service, and his mature interiority enabled him to become expert in directing others on their spiritual paths. One of the early Jesuits, Diego Lainez, wrote in 1547, "For the first 4 months at Manresa, Ignatius said many vocal prayers, and his extreme penances endangered his health." Let's read 19 and 20 in Ignatius's autobiography. First disturbances, page 21. He used to ask for alms in Manresa each day. He wouldn't eat meat or drink wine, even if they gave it to him. On Sundays he didn't fast, and if they gave him a little wine, he would drink it. And because he had been very careful about keeping his hair, as was the fashion at the time, and he had it nice, he decided to let it grow just anyhow as nature took it, without combing it or cutting it, nor covering it with anything by night or by day. For the same reason he was letting the nails on his toes and fingers grow, because on this point too he had been careful. While he was in this almshouse, something happened to him many times. In full daylight, he would see clearly something in the air alongside him, which would give him much consolation, because it was very beautiful, enormously so. He couldn't properly make out what it was an image of, but somehow it seemed to him that it had the shape of a serpent, and it had many things which shone like eyes, though they weren't eyes. He used to take much delight and be consoled by seeing this thing, and the more times he saw it, the more his consolation would increase. And when that thing used to disappear from his sight, he would feel sad about it. Up to this time he had always persisted almost in one identical interior state, with largely unvarying happiness, without having any acquaintance with spiritual things within the self. In those days, while that vision was continuing, or some short time before it began, because it went on for many days, there came to him a harsh thought which troubled him. The difficulty of his way of life would present itself to him as if it was being said to him inside his soul. And how are you going to be able to stand this life, the 70 years you're meant to live? But to this he responded, also interiorly, with great force, sensing that it was from the enemy, "You wretch, can you promise me 1 hour of life?" And in that way he overcame the temptation and was left calm. This was the first temptation that came to him after what has been recounted above. It was while he was entering a church where he used to hear the main mass each day, as well as vespers and compline, all sung, feeling great consolation at this. And he would normally read the Passion during Mass, always going along in a state of serenity. His life was calm at first. Then he experienced periods of alternating desolation and consolation so extreme that at one point he contemplated suicide. And finally, in this period, Ignatius felt he had been transformed into another man. He also experienced 2 serious illnesses at Manresa. Ignatius did seek out spiritual guides to assist him during this time, but he found them of little help. There is no evidence that he had ongoing spiritual direction. He found few whose spiritual life agreed with his own. The trials he experienced during this time he referred to as transforming lights. These lights were the Trinity, the creation of the world, the Eucharist, and Christ's humanity, all of which he found himself having a deep insight to following the sufferings. These contemplations made a profound and lasting impact on him. It was these, he said, that confirmed his faith. He was given a lasting illumination on the banks of the Cardinere River. Ignatius recounts it as thus, quote, "The eyes of his understanding began to open. It was not that he beheld any vision, but rather he comprehended and understood many things about the spiritual life, as well as faith and learning." Close quote. Again, we see here that environment plays a key role in revelation in the life of Ignatius. Ignatius was deeply moved by these visions, attaching great importance to them throughout his life. It has been described that the graces Ignatius received were intellectual lights directly infused by God. Such visions occurred in the lives of other saints, such as Teresa of Avila. What is revealed by Ignatius through his explanation of these visions and also his emphasis on them is that he was a true contemplative. This contemplative way is present in the life of Ignatius as God is present to his soul through intellectual consciousness, which constitutes the essential foundation of infused contemplation. An explanation of infused contemplation. In the Roman Catholic tradition, infused or higher contemplation, also called intuitive, passive, or extraordinary, is a supernatural gift by which a person's mind and will become totally centered on God. This was the experience of Ignatius in this period. The second part of this spiritual stage of Ignatius's life concerns his pilgrimage to the Holy Lands in Jerusalem. This pilgrimage deepened his devotion to the humanity of Christ and to the mysteries of his earthly life. It also fostered in Ignatius himself a deep desire to help others. We're not aware of exactly what Ignatius experienced, but something happens to him in Palestine that convinces him that it is not God's will for him to remain there, which was his initial intention. But he is silent on what brought about this conviction. Ignatius only reports, quote, "Once the said pilgrim had understood that it was God's will he should not be in Jerusalem, he constantly had thoughts about what was to be done. In the end, he was inclining more towards studying for a time in order to be able to help souls and was coming to the decision to go to Barcelona. Hence he set out for Venice and Genoa." Close quote. His desire for study is an indication that he saw that he had to help souls by doing more than engaging in pious conversations. He desires to acquire the skills and training to exercise a genuine apostolic ministry. And so Ignatius begins to study in 1524 under Master Ardeval in Barcelona. This period spreads over a decade, and it consists of study intermingled with apostolic works. Although Ignatius refers to his study as a distraction, there is evidence by eyewitness accounts that he was still able to spend a lot of the time in prayer, but not the 7 hours that he was managing to do at Manresa. In the way Ignatius speaks to his biographer, at the time that he was in Paris, we see that this period is distinctive in his interior development and is different from the other periods of his life. However, we have no exact information of Ignatius' interior life between February 1528 and March 1535. We can glean some idea about it, however, through his actions. We do know that he did walk on foot and fasted for the entire journey to Rouen, and that he was rewarded with much consolation, and that he was still engaged in his apostolic and charitable works. But we do not know about the nature of his prayer life at this time. But we have little doubt that all of his varied experiences in this time could not have failed to exercise a profound influence on his spiritual life. Certainly we know Ignatius continued to grow. This distraction was not a time of relaxation, but rather a time of inward enrichment, with Ignatius remaining under a guidance of strong grace, which caused the essential elements of infused union to stay with him. It is interesting that his companions and others at the time did not note any signs of his interior life. This is interesting in the life of the saint because no matter who it is or what tradition, those who spend a long time in contemplation, meditation, isolation, deep in prayer, usually have some external signs. For instance, Buddhist nun Tenzin Palmo spent 12 years in a cave. Vicky Mackenzie, her biographer of that period, writes an interesting revelation for us on first meeting Tenzin Palmo shortly after she left her cave. Vicky Mackenzie met her in Europe, and she writes, "The next day I saw her again in the garden. This time she was sitting alone, and seeing my chance, I approached. Did she mind if I joined her for a little while? The smile stretched from ear to ear in greeting, and a pair of the most penetrating blue eyes gazed steadily into mine. There was calmness there, and kindness, laughter too. But the most outstanding quality was an unmistakable luminosity. The woman virtually glowed. In fact, she was a most interesting-looking person. She had sharp features and a long pointed nose and small, neat ears. Maybe it was her cropped hair and lack of makeup, but there was also something decidedly androgynous about her, as though a sensitive male were lodging within." Vicky Mackenzie does note that when she met up with Tenzin Palmo many years later, although she still bore the same demeanour and characteristics, that luminosity had paled somewhat. We do get an insight into the habitual thoughts that inspired Ignatius in this period in a letter he wrote to Isabel Rosa in November 1532. Isabel Rosa was a benefactor to Ignatius. Let us look at her letter. For those of you studying online, the letter can be found on ARC. It is evident in this letter that the idea of praising God and acting in his service is still very much at the forefront of Ignatius's concerns. We see repeated God's service and praise. In other translations, the word glory appears. In a letter he wrote to his brother in the same year, he repeated this phrase 3 times on one page. Again, we see that sickness is a blessing. Service is battling against the world, raising the standard against the world, and in bearing insults, false accusations, and in that forbearance we imitate Christ. Ignatius's line of thought is unbroken from Manresa to Paris, right through to the time of writing the constitutions. Ignatius received his degree of a Master of Arts at Paris in April 1534. In the remaining 2 decades of his life, 2 stages of his interior life can be identified. His departure from Paris to Spain in April 1535. This period is still one of preparation and transition. In December 1535, Ignatius arrives in Venice and spends the year alone. We know that he was finishing his studies during this time, but of other activities or aspects of his life we know little else. In January 1537, he is joined by his companions, and with permission of Pope Paul III, those among the 10 who had not yet taken holy orders were ordained priests in June. To prepare for their first masses, they divided up to different places to spend 40 days in prayer and doing penance from July until September, after which they came together at Vivarolo and resumed their charitable works. In November, Ignatius was in Rome with Lainez and Favre. They enjoyed a favourable reception of the Pope. In 1538, Ignatius gathered the companions together at Easter. Their intention at this time, or as they had discerned it, was to proceed to the Holy Land. In Lent of 1539, desiring to ensure the continuity of the good, they saw God working in and through them. They began to explore the question of where to from here. Their decisions are mapped out in a document known as the Formula, which was approved by the Pope in 1540. Returning to the examination of Ignatius's interior life, we know he did make a 40-day retreat with Favre and Lainez and continued to journey, practice penance and pray. And of course, he continued any charitable works. By his own account, he enjoyed heavenly favours at this time. He delayed celebrating his first Mass until Christmas of 1538. In his autobiography, he connects this delay to a grace he received in November 1537 in the chapel of La Storta, when, quote, he sensed such a change in his soul and saw so clearly that God the Father was putting him with Christ his Son, that he would not have the wilfulness to doubt this at all. It could only be God the Father who was placing him with his Son. This association with Jesus remained with Ignatius throughout his life, and is the main aspect of this vision that Ignatius took with him. Hugo Rana, S.J., brother of Karl, says that what Ignatius with such confidence asked Mary to obtain for him was what the Father gave him in this vision. There's a clearness of evidence that allowed Ignatius no doubt, and with the power that he felt transformed his soul. This vision had a lasting impact. In relation to the spiritual exercises, it is this grace that the retreatant asks for in the triple colloquy at the end of the meditation on the 2 standards in the spiritual exercises. It is the same grace that Ignatius enjoyed that the retreatant too asks of the Lord to give to them. Let us now turn to the spiritual exercises 147 on pages 311 to 12. And having read this passage, write a brief couple of sentences on the grace asked for in the forum on Ark. How can we transfer this into a contemporary image without losing the essence of the request? What language can we use today to convey the same meaning of requesting the standard of Christ as his companion in poverty and humiliations? The vision of La Storta was a mystical granting of this prayer. A word or two on mystical marriage. In the lives of saints, this bonding, this mystical marriage with Christ occurs. Catherine of Siena is but one example. Ignatius' choice of a company of Jesus is linked with this vision. It was not through their wills alone that they had decided to follow Jesus in all things, but they were called and sustained by this grace of the Father. So for Ignatius, the starting point for the whole of his interior life is that of outstanding service of God. This bond, this essential aspect of Ignatius' charism was not for him alone, but this charism extends to his companions. All of the company expressed this solicitude for better service of God, and it is this that informs their decisions about the essential aspect of their mission. In Lent 1539, they agreed that their vocations in the society called them to, quote, find God's will according to their vocation, and to offer themselves as a sacrifice to God, to give glory, honour and praise, and greater service of God. When they decided to vow obedience to one among them as superior, so that they may be better able and more exactly to accomplish God's will in all things. While this is a strong bond, it is not in the style of a mystical marriage. In Ignatian spirituality, it is not the individual soul that bonds with Christ, but rather it is the church who is the spouse of Christ. In Ignatius's mind, he was called to great service and sacrifice. We now turn to a contemporary word on the psychology of sacrifice to help us better understand what was at work in the life of Ignatius in his day and how it might relate to our own. Jordan Peterson speaks about the psychology of sacrifice. How can we make sense of this desire in our day?
Because of these lectures, I've been reading the Bible, and I'm obviously not finished, but I'm fairly familiar with how it goes. And I've been thinking about two parts of it in specific, which is the story of Isaac and the crucifixion of Christ, and particularly one of the things that Christ says on the cross, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I've been trying to understand that because that's one hell of a thing for the Son of God to say.
And, yeah, you'd think that would have been edited out. Yeah, no, seriously, it's like, why isn't that gone? You know, it's very inconvenient.
Yeah, and you haven't touched on the story of Isaac yet, but there's this thing called typology, which I'm sure you're aware of, but basically the idea that what's going on in the Old Testament is sort of the laying out of types for Christ, and that Isaac is essentially a type of Christ because they have all these similarities. And so I've been thinking about it in that context and thinking about the parallels between them, between Isaac and Christ. And one of the things that also struck me was mostly the differences between Isaac and Christ. And the main difference, it seems to me, is sort of a difference in direction of sacrifice. So the sacrifices of Abraham is Abraham sacrificing his son to God. And then the sacrifice of Jesus is God sacrificing his son to mankind. And I've been trying to understand basically how that works. And in relation to the...
you and Western civilization for 2,000 years. Yeah. Well, there is these transformations of sacrifice, right? That continue. So the next thing that happens in these stories is that the circumcision starts to come in as a sacrifice, and it seems to be something like the beginnings of replacement for sacrifice of animals. It's, you know, there's this psychologization of sacrifice. So first it's pure external and acted out, and then it becomes something that's more conceptual. Like it becomes embodied in the form of the circumcision, and then it becomes more conceptual. And that conceptual transformation keeps occurring. And it seems to, well, it culminates to some degree in this idea of the sacrifice of Christ, who's God sacrificing his son to mankind, but the sacrifice is much more complex than that, right? It's also Christ sacrificing himself to God. And I think that the issue there is something like, well, let's say you're supposed to offer up the best that you have to God. That's the sacrifice. That's what happens with the high-quality animals that Abel sacrifices. Okay, but there's something better than the best that you own. Well, what's that? Well, part of it might be, well, the relationships you have with people. Are you willing to sacrifice them to pursue the highest good? Well, then are you willing to sacrifice yourself or your son, like your son might be. That's a tough one. I can understand the idea of sacrificing yourself better. I'm still wrestling with this story of Isaac, obviously, because that's such a complicated story, and I do think it's reasonable to think about it as a form of foreshadowing, at least the way the Bible is set up. Of course, people who aren't Christian wouldn't agree with that, but that's fine. The idea that you would offer yourself as a sacrifice to God, that seems to me to follow quite logically, because, well, obviously you have nothing greater to give than the best of yourself, right? So you sacrifice yourself to the highest good, and that's part of the way in which humanity is redeemed. That makes sense to me. That just seems like, for me, that's a pretty straightforward psychological truth. The son issue, that's a lot tougher thing to wrestle with, because
one of the things I was thinking with what Jesus says on the cross is that one of the interpretations of that is basically that Jesus in that moment is human. Basically, is not
right.
Divine. It's just Jesus, the human.
Right.
But that always kind of felt a little bit like avoiding the question to me, because you can't just posit something like the Trinity and then say, oh, but in this moment that doesn't go, right? That doesn't count. So, but if we think about it in that way of like the difference in the direction of sacrifice, and it seems to me that in the sacrifice, whoever is making the sacrifice sort of aims toward something. So Abraham is sort of reaching for the divine when he's going to sacrifice his son. And so that would mean maybe God is reaching toward the human. And so that would make some sense of that interpretation that Christ is only human in that moment, right? That it's the sacrifice is accomplished and the reaching down is accomplished. But I'm still left with a question, what do I make of that? Because that's one interesting interpretation.
I mean, it's useful to have a problem like that because it gives you something to think about, right? And something to study further. And it's a major problem. I mean, the whole issue of, well, we could say, well, what's the relationship between the divine and the human, which is obviously brought to the forefront in the idea of Christ, right? But it's a personal issue because part of the issue is what's the relationship between you as a finite entity and the transcendent infinity that surrounds you. Well, there's some relationship because here you are and the transcendent infinity around you exists. So there's a relationship. The question is, what is the relationship? And we don't know that. And it's dramatized in that story. And so, I mean, partly the reason that there's so much conflict and confusion in that story is because it's trying to bring opposing things together, right? How can something be God and man at the same time? It's just like the genie, which is the root word of genius, by the way. The genie is this incredibly powerful force that can grant wishes, right? But it's constrained in this tiny little space. There's an intimation there that for something to be real, it has to straddle the divide between the finite and the infinite. And that's what human beings do, I think, to some degree. And that's dramatized in that story, but it doesn't mean that we understand it. I mean, you know that sometimes you're going to feel that way when you're called upon to make a sacrifice. You're going to feel that you've been betrayed by everything. And I mean, the story's set up that way, right? Christ is betrayed by tyranny. He's betrayed by his best friends. He's betrayed by his mortality. Like, it's an archetypal story and he's innocent. So the story can't be any worse. That's why it's archetypal. And I mean, the story says to some degree that under such conditions, even God himself would have doubts. It's something like that. And that's a powerful idea. It's a very powerful idea. So that's the best I can make out of that for now.
So, what do you think about sacrifice? Perhaps jot down some of your thoughts about how a modern day disciple, how we can understand the place of sacrifice in the life of Christian faith today, before moving on to the next slide. This period of Ignatius's life is one of maturity of his interior life, witnessed in the living out of his exterior life. We see in this period Ignatius with a deep understanding of his identity, his vocation, and the accomplishment of his mission as founder of the Jesuits. The preparation period of his life is now complete. Linnaeus said of Ignatius in 1547 that he took so much care of his conscience that, quote, each day he compared week to week, month to month, day to day, close quote, of the way he lived each moment, seeking to advance in Christ's service and in holiness. Ignatius truly wanted to live a holy life. While Ignatius admits himself that at no other time in his life did he experience the profound transformation as he had at the river of Cardener, he did from that time continue to make progress in his spiritual life through daily attentiveness to himself, his relationships, and the accomplishment of what he felt was entrusted to him by God to do. These singular moments in the spiritual journey are not long-lasting and continuously life-changing. Continuous benefits of mystical experience must be consciously applied and worked on. They can pass, they can be forgotten. The impact does not necessarily have to be lasting, no matter how deep or profound the initial experience was. For example of this, I want to just spend a little bit of time looking at the life of Thomas Merton and reading from his 7-Story Mountain. Thomas Merton speaks of his transformative experience that happened to him in Rome. I begin the reading. I had a lot of books with me, a strange mixture. Dryden, the poems of D.H. Lawrence, some Tauchnitz novels, and James Joyce's Ulysses in a fancy Indian paper edition, slick and expensive, which I lent to someone later on and never got back. Things were going on as they usually did with me, but after about a week, I don't know how it began, I found myself looking into churches rather than into ruined temples. Perhaps it was the frescoes on the wall of an old chapel, ruined too, at the foot of the Palatine, and at the edge of the Forum, that first aroused my interest in another and a far different Rome. From there, it was an easy step to Saints Cosmos and Damian across the Forum, with a great mosaic in the apse of Christ coming in judgment in a dark blue sky, with a suggestion of fire in the small clouds beneath his feet. The effect of this discovery was tremendous. After all the vapid, boring, semi-pornographic statuary of the empire, what a thing it was to come upon the genius of an art full of spiritual vitality and earnestness and power. An art that was tremendously serious and alive and eloquent and urgent in all it had to say. And it was without pretentiousness, without fakery, and had nothing theatrical about it. Its solemnity was made all the more astounding by its simplicity, and by the obscurity of the places where it lay hid, and by its subservience to higher ends, architectural, liturgical, and spiritual ends, which I could not even begin to understand, but which I could not avoid guessing, since the nature of the mosaics themselves and their position and everything about them proclaimed it aloud. I was fascinated by these Byzantine mosaics. I began to haunt the churches where they were to be found, and, as an indirect consequence, all the other churches that were more or less of the same period. And thus, without knowing anything about it, I became a pilgrim. I was unconsciously and unintentionally visiting all the great shrines of Rome and seeking out their sanctuaries with some of the eagerness and avidity and desire of a true pilgrim, though not quite for the right reason. And yet it was not for a wrong reason either, for these mosaics and frescoes and all the ancient altars and thrones and sanctuaries were designed and built for the instruction of people who were not capable of immediately understanding anything higher. I never knew what relics and what wonderful and holy things were hidden in the churches whose doors and aisles and arches had become the refuge of my mind. Christ's cradle and the pillar of the flagellation and the true cross and St. Peter's chains and the tombs of the great martyrs, the tomb of the child St. Agnes and the martyr St. Cecilia and of Pope St. Clement and of the great deacon St. Lawrence, who was burned on a gridiron. These things did not speak to me, or at least I did not know they spoke to me, but the churches that enshrined them did, and so did the art on their walls. And now for the first time in my life, I began to find out something of the who this person was that men called Christ. It was obscure, but it was a true knowledge of him in some sense, truer than I knew and truer than I would admit. But it was in Rome that my conception of Christ was formed. It was there I first saw him, whom I now serve as my God and my King, and who owns and rules my life. It is the Christ of the Apocalypse, the Christ of the martyrs, the Christ of the fathers. It is the Christ of St. John and of St. Paul and of St. Augustine and St. Jerome and all the fathers and of the desert fathers. It is Christ God, Christ King, for in him dwelleth the fullness of the Godhead corporally, and you are filled in him, who is the head of all principality and power. For in him were all things created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominations or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and in him. And he is before all, and by him all things consist. Because in him it hath well pleased the Father that all fullness should dwell. Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, the first begotten of the dead, and the prince of the kings of the earth, who hath loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood, and hath made us a kingdom and priests to God his Father. The saints of those forgotten days had left upon the walls of their churches words which by the peculiar grace of God I was able in some measure to apprehend, although I could not decode them all. But above all, the realest and most immediate source of this grace was Christ himself, present in those churches, in all his power and in his humanity, in his human flesh, and his material, physical, corporeal presence. How often I was left entirely alone in these churches with the tremendous God and knew nothing of it, except I had to know something of it, as I say, obscurely. And it was he who was teaching me who he was, more directly than I was capable of realizing. The mosaics told me more than I had ever known of the doctrine of a God of infinite power, wisdom, and love, who had yet become man and revealed in his manhood the infinity of power, wisdom, and love that was his Godhead. Of course, I could not grasp and believe these things explicitly, but since they were implicit in every line of the pictures I contemplated with such admiration and love, surely I grasped them implicitly. I had to, insofar as the mind of the artist reached my own mind and spoke to it his conception and his thought, and so I could not help but catch something of the ancient craftsman's love of Christ, the Redeemer and Judge of the world. So far, however, there had been no deep movement of my will, nothing that amounted to a conversion, nothing to shake the iron tyranny of moral corruption that held my whole nature in fetters. But that also was to come. It came in a strange way, suddenly, a way that I will not attempt to explain. I was in my room. It was night. The light was on. Suddenly it seemed to me that Father, in speaking of his own Father, who had now been dead more than a year, was there with me. The sense of his presence was as vivid and as real and as startling as if he had touched my arm or spoken to me. The whole thing passed in a flash, but in that flash instantly I was overwhelmed with a sudden and profound insight into the misery and corruption of my own soul, and I was pierced deeply with a light that made me realize something of the condition I was in, and I was filled with horror at what I saw, and my whole being rose up in revolt against what was within me, and my soul desired escape and liberation and freedom from all this with an intensity and an urgency unlike anything I had ever known before. And now I think for the first time in my whole life I really began to pray, praying not with my lips and with my intellect and my imagination, but praying out of the very roots of my life and of my being, and praying to the God I had never known, to reach down towards me out of his darkness and to help me to get free of the 1,000 terrible things that held my will in their slavery. There were a lot of tears connected with this, and they did me good. And all the while, although I had lost the first vivid, agonizing sense of the presence of my father in the room, I had him in my mind, and I was talking to him as well as to God, as though he were a sort of intermediary. I do not mean this in any way that might be interpreted that I thought he was among the saints. I did not really know what that might mean then, and now that I do know, I would hesitate to say that I thought he was in heaven. Judging by my memory of the experience, I should say it was as if he had been sent to me out of purgatory. For after all, there was no reason why the souls in purgatory should not help those on earth by their prayers and influence, just like those in heaven, although usually they need our help more than we need theirs. But in this case, assuming my guess has some truth in it, things were the other way around. However, this is not a thing on which I would place any great stress, and I do not offer any definite explanation of it. How do I know it was not merely my own imagination or something that can be traced to a purely natural psychological cause? I mean the part about my father. It is impossible to say. I do not offer any explanation, and I have always had a great antipathy for everything that smells of necromancy, table turning and communications with the dead, and I would never deliberately try to enter into any such thing. But whether it was imagination or nerves or whatever else it may have been, I can say truly that I did feel most vividly as if my father were present there, and the consequences that I have described followed from this, as though he had communicated to me without words an interior light from God about the condition of my own soul, although I wasn't even sure I had a soul. The one thing that seems to me morally certain is that this was really a grace. A great grace. If I had only followed it through, my life might have been very different and much less miserable for the years that were to come. It was a vain hope, however. Merton then describes returning to England and getting back into his beer-swilling, womanizing lifestyle. However, as we know, grace continued to work in Merton's life, in spite of him in many ways, until much later when he began seriously to cooperate with it and entered the monastery. These graces that enter our life require work. We cannot ignore them, and if we wish to sustain the initial, deep, transforming experience, we must discipline ourselves to continue to walk the path that God has invited us upon. Let's now read a brief article by Anne Strichards on conversion stories. When you have read this article, please add any comments to a new thread in the forum on ARC. Please pause here to read the article. Let's now continue with 1540 and 1556. Ignatius at this stage had reached a point of maturity in his sanctity and also a full consciousness of his vocation and mission as founder. In Rome in 1538, Ignatius and his companions gave thought to forming a religious order. They were thinking of a society of priests in the style of other orders that had been approved at this time, orders of clerics. The formula of the institute that had been approved by Pope Paul III on September 27, 1540, gave them a good foundation. Ignatius had been elected as general on April 8, 1541, and the companions had all taken their first vows on April 21, 1541. Thus, they possessed the essential features of a religious order. Ignatius' vocation had crystallized. He was the founder and superior of a new religious society in the Catholic Church. In the last 15 years of Ignatius's life, his spirituality was a defining feature of the spirituality of the nascent Society of Jesus. His spiritual experiences in this time were decisive and served to define the characteristic traits that we can recognize today of Ignatian spirituality. There are two sources to draw upon to understand these personal experiences of Ignatius in this period of his life: what his companions have recorded about him, and the fragment of St. Ignatius's spiritual diary. It was recorded in two copybooks. The first copybook covers the period between February the 2nd to March 1544. There remain also sheets containing segments of this diary which Ignatius thought important for ready reference. The recording of experiences is very important in Ignatius's spiritual life. This journaling of his most intimate experiences forms a key practice into developing and maturing his relationship with God. It is to these notes that he refers back to throughout his life, and they form part of his prayer rituals and discernment processes. There are also those notes recorded by others, such as Ribadenea and the memorial of Gonçalo da Câmara. It is evident that Ignatius was a soul led by God. Anyone looking at his life and his texts and his writings and the way he lived it is really left in no doubt that his life was divinely inspired. As we examine these texts, there is evidence of infused contemplation. Dagobert describes these characteristics of such a state as, quote, an experience of God as being present under a form of knowledge which is simultaneously general and obscure, yet rich and satisfying. An experience of love which penetrates the soul. The experience of the mystic of being under the powerful control of God. The mystic's inability to control these episodes, either to bring them on, prolong them, or draw himself out of the state when experiencing them. These states are entirely spontaneous. Also, the inability to adequately describe the experience or even convey an idea of them to one who has not experienced such a mystical state. Jerome Nadal, one of Ignatius's closest companions and was instrumental in shaping the Society of Jesus. It is the classroom that we are now in, which is named in tribute to him. He described a special grace gifted to Ignatius. He said that Ignatius was gifted with the ability to see and contemplate in all things, actions, conversations, the presence of God and love of spiritual things, and to remain contemplative even in the midst of action. All who knew Ignatius testified to his ability to recollect himself in the midst of daily business. There are many testimonies that Ignatius would be moved to tears during Mass or while at prayer in his room, overwhelmed by the presence and love of God. These experiences left him consoled. Let us turn now to the spiritual diary in your text. The Mass of the Trinity, number 3, section 20, on pages 83 to 4. February the 21st. Very great and quite continuous devotion throughout the period of prayer, warm clarity and spiritual enjoyment. Also I felt drawn partly to rise in some way. Later, when I prepared in my room, when at the altar and while I vested, I had more interior spiritual impulses and felt moved to weep. After Mass, I remained in great spiritual repose. During Mass, the tears were more copious than the previous day and lasted continuously. Occasionally my power of speech was cut off. Once or perhaps a few times I felt spiritual intuition so great that I seemed to understand that almost nothing more could be known on the subject of the Blessed Trinity. And this was due to the following. Before, when I wanted to obtain devotion in the Blessed Trinity, I had not desired nor adapted myself to seek for it or to find it when saying prayers to the Father. For I thought consolation and visitation in the Blessed Trinity would not occur then. But during this Mass, I knew or felt or saw, God knows, that on speaking to the Father and seeing that he was the one person of the Trinity, I felt moved to love all the Trinity, especially as the other persons were all in the Trinity by their very essence. The same feeling when I prayed to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. When I felt consolation, I was delighted with any one of them, and I rejoiced in acknowledging it as coming from all three. So great an achievement did it seem to have untied this knot or accomplished something similar that I could not stop repeating to myself with reverence to myself, who are you, from where, etc. What did you deserve? Why this, etc. The Mass, the celebration of the Eucharist, became very important to Ignatius in these years, but it also drained his physical strength. So much so that he had to confine himself to celebrating Mass on feasts and on Sundays only. But he still attended Mass on days that he did not say it himself. After Mass, he would recollect himself and pray for a period of over 2 hours. Following these periods of profound prayer experiences, Ignatius was granted insights into theological understandings of the persons of the Trinity. Ignatius's experiences are similar in nature to the mystical phenomena described by St. John of the Cross in Living Flame, stanza 4, part 4, which I will now read. St. John writes, "There are many kinds of awakening that God effects in the soul, so many that we would never finish explaining them all. Yet this awakening of the Son of God that the soul wishes to refer to here is one of the most elevated and beneficial. For this awakening is a movement of the Word in the substance of the soul, containing such grandeur, dominion, glory, and intimate sweetness that it seems to the soul that all the balms and fragrant spices and flowers of the world are commingled, stirred and shaken so as to yield their sweet odour, and all the kingdoms and dominions of the world and all the powers and virtues of heaven are moved. Not only this, but it also seems that all the virtues and substances and perfections and graces of every created thing glow and make the same movement all at once. Since, as St. John the Evangelist says, all things in him are life, and in him they live and are and move, as the Apostle declares, it follows that when within the soul this great Emperor moves, whose principality, as Isaiah says, he bears on his shoulders, which consists of 3 spheres, celestial, terrestrial, and infernal, and the things contained in them, upholding them all, as St. Paul says, with the word of his power, all things seem to move in unison. This happens in the same manner as when at the movement of the earth all material things in it move as though they were nothing. So it is when this prince moves, who himself carries his court, instead of his court carrying him." Hold that reading before you as we turn to the spiritual diary of St. Ignatius and read an account of his experience. Page 87, part 26, February the 27th. During the customary prayer I did quite well, and all was as usual until halfway through, then a marked improvement, great devotion, quiet and spiritual gentleness, until the end inclusive. Afterwards there remained in me a continuing devotion. I made my preparation my room and commended myself to Jesus, not asking for any further confirmation, but that before the Blessed Trinity he might do his best service, etc., on my behalf, in the way that would be most suitable, that I might find myself in their grace. At that I received some light and strength. I entered the chapel, and while praying felt, Or to put it more exactly, I saw, not by natural power, the Blessed Trinity and also Jesus, who was representing me, or placing me before the Trinity, or acting as a mediator close to the Blessed Trinity, that I might communicate in that intellectual vision. On feeling and seeing in this way, I was covered in tears and love, but with Jesus as the object, and toward the Blessed Trinity, a respect of submission, more like a reverential love than anything else. Later I felt in a similar way that Jesus was performing the same task when I thought of praying to the Father, for it seemed I could feel within me that he was doing everything before the Father and the Blessed Trinity. Many tears when I began Mass, and much devotion and more tears all through it. Similarly, at one stage I saw in a remarkable way the same vision of the Blessed Trinity as before, while my love towards the Divine Majesty grew even greater. At times there was a tendency to lose my power of speech. After Mass, during prayer, and several times later, when near the fire, a great intense devotion directed towards Jesus, some special interior impulses to weep or still further. When I write this, my understanding feels drawn to see the Blessed Trinity and appears to see, although not distinctly as before, three persons. During Mass, when I said the prayer that begins Domini Jesu Christi, Filii Dei Vivi, etc., it seemed to me in spirit that whereas before I had seen Jesus, as I said, then what I saw was white. That is, his humanity, and on this occasion my feeling in my soul was different. That is, I was not aware of the humanity alone, but of Jesus as being completely my God, etc., with a fresh rush of tears and great devotion, etc. It is clear that Ignatius is recording these experiences for himself alone, so that he may recall these movements at some time in the future, and that he may return to them to continue to discern the truths revealed in them. On February the 15th, in his spiritual diary, he wrote, "With so many intuitions they could not be written." Further example of the nature of these experiences you can read in the spiritual diary, which I encourage you to do over the next week. In Ignatius' spiritual diary, it reveals three main traits of his mysticism. Its focus is Trinitarian and Eucharistic. It is orientated always to service flowing out of love rather than from a mystical union, and as a result of the action of grace on the entirety of his humanity, spiritual and corporeal, rather than through introversion. The humanity of Christ, the Blessed Virgin and the saints always appear in his prayer experiences as mediators or intercessors. Let us now read the February 23rd entry, number 22 on page 84 in the spiritual diary. Let us look at Mass of the Trinity number 5, written on the 23rd of February, Article 22 of the Spiritual Diary. It begins on page 84 in your text. During the customary prayer, at first nothing, from halfway through I found considerable devotion and satisfaction of soul, together with some indication of shining clarity. While I prepared the altar, Jesus came into my thoughts, and I felt impelled to follow him. For to my mind it seemed that since he was the head of the society, he was a greater argument for having complete poverty than all the other human reasons, although all the other reasons that had been used in the election seemed to me to reinforce the same conclusion. This thought impelled devotion, tears, and the firm certainty that even if no tears came during the Mass, or during other Masses, this conviction would suffice amid temptations and tribulations to make me stand firm. I continued walking with these thoughts, and vested. They increase evermore, appearing to be a confirmation of what I had done, even if I received no consolations on this point. It seemed in some way to be from the Blessed Trinity that Jesus was shown or felt, and I remembered the time when the Father put me with the Son. When I had finished vesting, so set was my intention that the name of Jesus impress itself on me, so encouraged was I, such a confirmation did I seem to receive for what lay ahead, that the tears and sobs came with new force. At the beginning of Mass, I was helped by great grace and devotion and wept peacefully throughout. Even when I had finished, a great devotion and new impulses to weep continued until I unvested. During Mass, there were several feelings in confirmation of what has been said. When I held the Blessed Sacrament in my hands, I was impelled to speak and felt intensely moved from within that I would never leave him, not for all heaven or earth or... Then new impulses, devotion and spiritual joy. For my part, I added the offering of what lay in my power, and this last restriction referred to my companions who had signed. Later, whenever I remembered Jesus during the day, or whenever I was reminded of him, I could in a certain way feel or see with my understanding the devotion and confirmation continued all the while. End of reading. So it's clear from this passage and many others that it seemed to Ignatius that Jesus accompanied his prayer to the Father. Time and time again we read in Ignatius's writings of the graces received during the Mass. The infused favours in the life of Ignatius were graces centred on Christ's sacrifice of the Mass and dominated by the Trinity whom this sacrifice makes present. These graces can be divided into two categories: light in the intellect and love in the will. Let's look now at February the 12th in the spiritual diary and again read the passage in Ignatius's own words. Article 16. It begins on page 80 in your text. During the customary prayer, I could feel no mediators or any other persons. I was coming to the end. I felt considerable relish and warmth. From the middle onwards, the tears were very copious and accompanied by warmth and interior relish. No intuitions. I considered the matter ended, and it seemed to me to be acceptable to God our Lord. When I rose and turned to the preparation before Mass, I thanked His Divine Majesty and offered him the oblation already made. Neither devotion nor the impulse to weep was lacking. On going out to Mass, preparing the altar, vesting and beginning Mass, considerable tears, very intense and copious during Mass, and such that very often I could not speak, especially during the whole of the long epistle of St. Paul, which begins, Libebente suffitus incipiens. I felt no flashes of understanding or of distinctions, nor was I conscious in any way of any persons. My love was most intense and accompanied by warmth and great relish in divine things. My soul's satisfaction increased greatly. After Mass in the chapel, and later while I knelt in my room, when I wished to give thanks for so many gifts and graces received, I lost all desire to remake offerings of the oblation made, although I was ever doing so, and not without devotion. Considering the matter as settled, on the other hand, I felt drawn by the devotion I experienced to stay there, enjoying the feeling. Later I wondered whether to go out or not, and decided with great peace in the affirmative. Thereupon I felt special interior impulses, and I wept. Although it seemed to me that I could have spent more time in tears, I rose, still weeping, and with my soul very satisfied, and set out having decided to complete the matter tomorrow, before dinner time at the latest, with thanksgiving, petition for strength, and a repetition of the offering already made out of devotion for the Blessed Trinity, celebrating the Mass in their honour. End of reading. The reading that Sunday that Ignatius refers to is 2 Corinthians 11, 19 to 33, chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. If you'd like to pause the presentation here to reflect on that reading and to spend some time in silent prayer before continuing with the rest of the presentation. It is notable that Ignatius differs in his mystical experience, as I referred to earlier, by the absence of the nuptial aspect of the mystical union. In the spiritual exercises, numbers 353 to 365, he presents the church as the spouse of Christ, but nowhere in his writings can we find a reference to an individual soul as spouse of Christ or God. While Ignatius's union with God and Jesus was intimate, he never saw the union as a spiritual marriage, as is the case in the lives of other mystics and saints in the church's tradition. His experience is very different, say, to that of John of the Cross's experience, as recorded in John's spiritual canticle and the living flame. So Ignatius's relationship to God is one of servant, not spouse. This service is to be done generously, heroically, and regardless of the cost. It is to be done humbly. Ignatius spent 40 days using the program written down in the exercises for making a good election to decide on the question of the society's approach to poverty, when that was under consideration by the members. Everything in the life of Ignatius was dominated and orientated to the service of God, giving God glory, learning God's will, and carrying it out. His counsels and methods are an echo of his own interior life. They are practical approaches which can, if practiced, with discipline and good intention, the right intent, will make the grace of God available to any, as it was available to Ignatius. It is the triple colloquies in the exercises that lead the retreatant to ask for the most important graces from Mary, Christ, and the Father. Let's now look at February the 23rd in the Spiritual Diary, section 22, page 84. The role imagination plays in the life of Ignatius is a large one. The graces Ignatius received, coupled with his disciplined, methodical approach to praying, was further enhanced by his ability to imagine himself in a gospel story with the Father, with the Trinity. In his rules for discernment of spirits, he instructs to distinguish the immediate action of God in the soul from the reactions which follow that are influenced by our own habits, biases, and inclinations. This assists the seer or the seeker to recognize true vision. The divine communication Ignatius experienced were always in the form of simple visions, with the exception of the grand vision at La Storta. One has to make reference to the gift of tears, which one reads repeatedly in Ignatius's writings. Therefore, it does warrant some attention. In the first part of the Spiritual Diary, tears are mentioned 175 times, and Ignatius stands alone among all of the saints for the frequency of this gift. The gift of tears cannot be explained by Ignatius's character, for he's had a strong personality, and from all accounts he had a robust self-esteem. In many ways, this gift is inexplicable, and you can choose whichever explanation appeals to you from among those who seek to explain it. For Ignatius, the material phenomenon of tears is connected to the infused graces and interior gifts he was granted, and therefore this outward manifestation of an interior experience is very dear to him. His many notes on this phenomena is not so that he can share these notes with others, but so he himself can recall the particular circumstances in which these gifts were granted to him. Let us now look at a letter to Borgia that he sent in 1548 that explains for Ignatius his feeling and thoughts about the gift of tears. Let us begin on page 206. I'm reading from the 8th paragraph. Instead of drawing blood and somehow trying to force it out in some way, you should seek more directly from the Lord of everyone his most holy gifts, for example, a flow or even a sprinkling of tears. These may come, 1, over your own sins or those of others, 2, over the salvific events in the life of Christ our Lord, here or in heaven, 3, from thinking of the divine persons or from love of them. The more sublime the thoughts and reflections that give rise to these tears, the more valuable and precious they are. But though the third of these reflections is in one sense better than the second, and the second than the first, what is best for each individual is that in which God our Lord imparts himself more fully, displaying his holiest of gifts and his spiritual graces. It is God who sees and knows what is better for a person, and God, knowing everything, shows the person the way forward. End of reading. When Ignatius did not weep at least 3 times in Mass, he considered himself deprived of consolation. However, this gift affected his health, and although he knew this, it was a practice that he had no power to stop. The ascetical practices in the life of Ignatius were many, and they did indeed lead him to deepen his interior life. His engagement in a frequent examination of conscience and examine is something to note, and something that exists today in Ignatian spirituality and plays a very important role in those wishing to seek God through Ignatian spirituality pathways and frameworks. Ignatius practiced it hourly. How he practiced it is recorded in his spiritual diary. It was said of him that in his outward movements you felt that reflection had preceded them always. Ignatius often begged God to make his will known to him through interior motions of his grace. In all ways, Ignatius lived a disciplined life, both interiorly and exteriorly. And yet, he is still described as warm, someone who had a deep, tender affection for his companions, although he did make them tremble, as we read in their memories and reflections of Ignatius. So finally, Ignatius the man. Ignatius as a man was imaginative and emotional, with an amazing capacity for self-reflection and analysis, accompanied by an iron will. He was impulsive, but he possessed good reasoning power. He was both firm and confident. He was a man of action. His study was a means to an end. A forceful character and leader who knew how to command with authority, but also authority with love. He experienced a mystical invasion at Manresa, which made a lasting imprint on him throughout his life. His sufferings due to ill health to the point of death, 2 at Manresa, at Paris and in Rome, and his difficulties with his studies, the persecutions that plagued him throughout his life, fashioned traits in him which cooperated with the gift of divine grace, giving him an inspiration of grace that was so strong it was evident throughout his life. His examens he practiced continually to keep his passions in check, and he was known as a man with unfailing self-mastery, a man dedicated to serving Christ. Perhaps the most outstanding trait in that service is the union of the intellectual and volitional powers. His graced experiences are the basis and point of departure for the spirituality of the entire Society of Jesus and Ignatian spirituality. Ignatian spirituality, flowing from Ignatius, is an apostolic spirituality in the service of Christ, his world, and his church. A spirituality that invites each and every one of us to participate in it actively and fully.